Welcome back to the Speaking and Communicating podcast. I am your host, Roberta Ndlela. If you are looking to improve your communication skills, both professionally and personally, this is the podcast you should be tuning into. Communication and soft skills are crucial for your career growth and leadership development. And by the end of this episode, please log on to Apple and Spotify and leave us a rating and a review. Now let's get communicating with David Ask, who's an entrepreneur and inventor. He is here to talk to us about how we communicate based on who we are, which is a very interesting concept. And before I go any further, please help me welcome him to the show. Hey, David.
Hey, good morning. Thank you so much for having me. I'm honored to be here with you.
Absolute pleasure. Welcome. Tell us a little bit about yourself.
Yeah, so I actually live in Nashville, Tennessee. I grew up in a little town in Minnesota, actually, but I've been in the South here for about 30 years. And I'm married for 25, and I've got two awesome teenagers, one in college and one as a senior in high school. And like you mentioned, I am an entrepreneur. I run a small business really out of our home. We, of course, have a lot of partners, across the country here. But my wife and I, yeah, largely run the business. And so about 10 years ago, along with my brother-in-law, we invented a thermostat guard. It's a box that goes over a thermostat, so people don't tamper with the thermostat. Usually in a public setting, but people use them in their homes as well, depending on the circumstance. But we were actually the first ones in the world to come up with a stat guard, as it were, with a combination lock. So we sell through Lowe's and the Home Depot and True Value Hardware, and we're growing that business. So along with that, I'm a pretty passionate guy in general. I run or facilitate a mastermind group within the Iron Sharpens Iron Mastermind, and it's for men. There's probably 150 men across, I think, 4 or 5 countries now, and walking with guys who are trying to move the needle, in their business and in their marriages and parenting and stuff is a real honor. And one of my really deep passions is helping dads, become better fathers. And it's amazing, by the way, when I saw your podcast, quite often when we want to communicate something, right, we need to consider our audience, but we also need to consider ourselves. And that
Mhm.
self-awareness piece is really, really important on how we show up. So yeah, that's a bit of a snapshot as to who I am and what I'm up to.
Thanks for sharing all that. So you moved from colder weather to warmer weather because I'm still
Yeah.
in the Midwest in Chicago.
Are you really? Yeah, yeah. You
Yes,
understand
yes,
cold.
yes. Your invention is very interesting for me because as a South African, when I first came here, I used to say, "What do Americans have against room temperature?" Why is everyone also adjusting the temperature? What? Just leave it. What do you guys have against room? Just whatever the weather is, just let it be that.
Well, and it's funny, so a month ago, my daughter is a musician as well as I am, and she did a violin tour with her group in Austria and Germany. And of course, Europe really doesn't think about, conditioned air like we do. So it was hot and the hotel rooms were hot, and once in a while you'd find a room with some air conditioning and so on. But the restaurants didn't have it, and heck, they don't even think of ice the same way we do. So it's a much different culture. So yeah, we had to adjust to that in a real hurry.
Right. Yeah. But obviously with your invention, the entire country is your market. So now let's talk about how when you were going to Home Depot, going to Lowe's and saying to them, please stock this, how do you first, based on communication, which you're going to talk about, how do you approach that? And those who said no to you, do you look back and say, it's because of how I approached the situation, of how I communicated, and things like that?
That's a really great question. Obviously on the front end, we were interested in just grabbing some attention, from the right person. So I think obviously there's different levels of communication, whether that's you know, a, a, a strategy where you work through someone to grab, to communicate, whether it's a headline that that communicates something, whether that's an email, phone call, or an in-person type of a meeting, and so on. And so for the longest time, really, for me, it was more of how do we actually access the decision maker, in a big box retail store. I mean, really, the first one we approached was the Home Depot, and it's an interesting thing. You can't call them, meaning they have a phone number, but
Mm-hmm.
of course it's an IVR. So when you call their number, it's if you know your party's extension, dial it now, and then of course they give you a menu, but it's not for new vendors. So it says if you're a potential vendor, you need to go on the website and submit, your product idea along with all of your financials and so on, because they want to, along with, I'm sure, a sea of other people trying to submit products, they want to make sure that not only do you have a good product,
Mm-hmm.
but you can actually do business with them, meaning you have the capital to, be able to actually sustain business with, 3,000 stores or something, 2,000 stores. Just because you have a good product doesn't necessarily mean that you're the right fit for them, because you have to be able to sustain that level of volume. So, that was one thing up front where, we didn't have any of that, right? I had a great idea. I got some of them, made with my life savings. And so up front, I largely followed Richard Branson's advice where he said, if an opportunity arises, say yes and figure it out.
I
And that's
remember his
exact.
book, Screw It, Let's Do It.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
And but that's largely what I did, right? We ended
Mhm.
up, finding a connection to get a meeting. And of course they were like, wow, this is great, right? Because there's thermostat guards out there that have been, sold for decades, but they all have a key. So if you lose that little tiny key, which is a big problem, then you got to rip it off the wall, fix the wall, paint the wall, put another one up. Well, I solved the lost key problem. And of course, our Stat Guard Plus looks a little more stylish as opposed to some of the older units that have been out there.
Mhm.
So, when they saw it, of course, they're like, wow, this is great. We get it. It makes sense. It's a better mousetrap situation. And of course, at that point, I needed to understand, well, how am I going to pull this off? They said yes. So then I said yes, but I needed to make my yes a yes, because I didn't have the financial wherewithal to stock the shelves one time, let alone, keep another 20,000 units around to restock and, understand supply chain and everything. So I ended up finding a partner, and licensing it and so on. But every step along the way, there was, communication happening. And of course it needed to be accurate. It needed to be, we needed to be able to tell the story in a way that gave confidence, to everyone involved. And I knew based upon past experiences that, what, if I have an opportunity, I think Branson is right. You can figure it out. There are options. And quite often it's not, necessarily how to do something, it's who, right? The book Who Not How.
Mhm.
You just find the right people, to sit in the right seat on the bus, and it's amazing what you can accomplish.
Did you find that your Home Depot audience, in when you were making a presentation and saying, okay, would like for you guys to stock this product, did what kind of questions did they ask? Were they technical questions on how this works, or, you know, doesn't the whole of America want this, and is it gonna sell? What type of
Yeah.
questions do they ask?
Well, so yeah, of course they protect the real estate, as it were, on their shelves, pretty heartily, and you can't blame them. It's pretty precious space. I mean, there's so many people wanting to get on that shelf. So what was nice, of course, in kind of my circumstances, they already had a product, almost identical to it, meaning they were selling thermostat guards. They just had a key.
Mhm.
And so anybody in facilities management, and that was something where I kind of had a little bit of a leg up, because I worked for a large telecom chain in facilities management for over a decade. And of course, in our stores and call centers and things like that, we had to use thermostat guards because everybody kept messing around with the thermostats. So I actually had concrete evidence of people losing the keys. And even the merchant, at the Home Depot there, he totally got it, right? He's like, oh, of course, because when they lose the key, typically you have to break the front cover off, and then you just see the back plate sitting there in a restaurant or a retail store. And anybody that has worked in facilities management or management of any kind in a retail setting, especially, that's a pretty common thing. So that really wasn't, I didn't have to do a lot of convincing. So of course they wanted to know, the quality of the product and what type of, plastic we were using and, the specs and things like that.
Mhm.
But, mine was pretty simple. So it wasn't, my product doesn't have any electronics or batteries or things like that. So there was really not a huge, I guess, a learning curve for anybody involved.
Not much technical detail, engineering type stuff where they feel like,
Right.
oh, we don't understand what this is going to do,
Right.
but his story sounds pretty good because usually that's what we encourage, especially the tech professionals, to say, you're the only one who speaks tech in the room, so make sure that you speak layman's terms when it comes to your customer. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And then, so back to communication as well. You say that we communicate based on who we are.
Yeah, so it's kind of a short story. I met a guy named Dr. Andy Garrett, who's in my mastermind group. He's a clinical psychologist out in California and has become a dear friend. And we do, certain events together. I'm actually the lead coach for his resiliency program. But one of the things that, after hanging out with him for a few years that was, has really been so impactful to me is when he started to kind of unpack, this idea of authenticity and identity and grit and resilience, and really this idea of intrinsic motivation versus extrinsic motivation.
Mm-hmm.
So what's fascinating is when you want to understand, like for instance, authenticity, we often get those things kind of mixed up. Most people would, a lot of people would say, I'm acting authentic, but it's just based upon emotions, right? I'm acting authentic today because I feel this way. Tomorrow, I might feel something else and I'm going to act according to my emotions over here.
And they
Whereas,
label that authenticity, meaning it's like when a kid throws their toys out of the court because at that
yeah,
moment they're having a tantrum.
yeah,
So
yeah.
do we call that authentic? Because adults literally do that sometimes.
Well, right. And it's
Mm.
so it's really important, for instance, I'll jump into the deep end of the pool here. So
Mhm.
where do we get the word authenticity? It comes from the word author. I mean, we didn't make us, right? I didn't make me. I didn't choose my eye color, my skin color, my taste buds. I didn't choose my own personality for that matter. How do we know that's true? Those of us who have siblings or, children for that matter, you can tell a little child's essence, within weeks and especially months and of course years, right? They're so different. They're wired so differently than their siblings. Their little personality and spirit is just so wonderful and precious. But
Mhm.
everything from their taste buds to the things that make them cry, to the things that make them laugh. I mean, all of that stuff is so different, and you can literally tell within just a matter of weeks. When they're 6 months old or 9 months old and they're starting to walk, and you're interacting with them. I've got two children, and they're vastly different. From an early age.
Sometimes even identical twins are
Well,
so
exactly,
different.
right? I mean, just because we,
Mhm.
our faces or whatever might look similar or something, we're so different. And so what I think is wonderful is, and this is one thing where I just kind of get a smile inside of me, and well, very literally for that matter, is when we start to identify, right? The word identity, when
Right.
we start identifying our own authenticity, and again, that's literally, mind, body, and spirit. So what do you believe about, spiritual things? What do you believe about your own mind and so on? So here's what's interesting. What is it that makes up authenticity? Well, a lot of people would, for instance, they would say convictions, values, virtues, and they would lump those things together. Well, they're not the same. Your values, we talk about core values.
Mhm.
What does your core, Roberta, what does your core happen to value most of all? What is the hierarchy? In the English language anyway, there's 80 or 100 or something like that of, potential core values, right? And you got to pick
Right.
the language. But here's the interesting thing is if you were to put a check mark next to the ones that resonate with you, narrow that down to 20, narrow that down to 10, narrow that down to 5, and then put those in priority, your values would be different than mine.
Mm.
You couple that with with convictions, right? That means just what you believe is right and wrong, good and bad. Your convictions are different from your values. Your values are the matrix at which you make decisions through. I mean,
Right.
you would hope so, right? But most people don't understand that. So their life just absolutely is chaotic because they're making decisions based on their emotions and not their plumb line,
Or
not their
whatever is
not their
happening at that
values.
moment, circumstance, trying
Right.
to just grasp for straws,
Yeah. Yeah. It's
survival
it's
sometimes, and we're not going to judge them on that. Life gets
yeah,
tough, and
sure.
yes, yes, yeah.
Yeah. But here's what's interesting. It goes even deeper. So you have values and convictions, but virtues.
Hmm.
What are the highest virtues that you have? A virtue is outward focused. It's what type of an impact, right? This whole dent in the universe thing. What type of an impact do you want to have uniquely? Well, I'll be honest, I take it even a step further. Some of the things that make us unique, it's hard to put language around. And I think I got this from a Nissan commercial, but what is it that gives your goosebumps? Right? What is it that puts that lump in your throat in a good way? What is it that is just causes you to, it just takes your breath away. And when you're doing it or seeing it or participating in it or becoming it, you're just like, oh my gosh, this feels transcendent. That's different for everybody.
Right.
So you start mixing convictions, values, virtues, goosebumps. Now, what about strengths? Right? You start adding in your hierarchy of strengths and how you want to apply those, and you really start to get a snapshot. Again, it's not, I'll be honest, I don't think it's the totality of what makes someone, human, but
Hmm.
it's a really great place to start. And I think you're probably 75% there. But most people have never identified, right? This word identity, of course, in our culture has been kind of hijacked. But if you start to identify all of the things that make you you from day one, right? You're good enough. You're fantastic. In fact, you don't have to generate something. You don't have to, you know, start acting in a particular way to find extrinsic validation, right? You're good enough. You're more than enough just the way you are. And you can relax into that person and identify the stuff that makes you you and just be yourself, right? So how do we know that's true?
Hmm.
Psychologists would say, when you follow the clues, right? Well, when you found your identity, when what? Well, you start to feel genuine. You start to feel natural. You start to, feel more resilient and free and so on. But how do you know you haven't found it? Well, anxiety is through the roof, maybe depression. You avoid certain people and circumstances, right? Social anxiety and things like that. Anger, or maybe easily angered, sadness, apathy, all that kind of stuff is front and center. So
So
what I
you
think is
act what you
really,
said earlier, you
yeah,
act in order to get the external validation.
yeah.
And that one is a very big, especially with social media. There's so much that
Oh, look,
people
yeah,
do nowadays for the external feedback, for the
yeah,
external validation.
yeah,
And if they were to just take a moment sometimes, be silent and go and find their identity,
yeah.
there are so many choices they wouldn't make and post on social media.
I mean, isn't it? It's crazy. And so what I think
Mm,
is fascinating to your question, this idea of starting with who, if you're going to communicate something that's really important to you, but you've not identified what's important to you, guess what? You're probably going to be taking on someone else's, definition of success. It could be a mentor, it could be your parents, it could be your older brother, it could be Roberta, it might be Joe Rogan, it might be somebody else that you admire because you don't have, that identity. You've not identified, right? Those things that are valuable to you. It's funny because in some ways it seems kind of complex, but yet it's the most elementary thing when we identify what God authored in us. And we just
mm.
label it, we identify it, write it down. That's who you are. And when you start acting in alignment with that, well, then you start feeling resilient and free and natural and normal and whatever else. But if you haven't, guess what? You're going to suffer and you're going to be desperate to have external validation and all the likes and, everything else. By the way, and I want to make sure, again, this is getting really personal, but we have to have external, you know, uh, I'll just say this, love, right? Especially when we're children.
Mm.
And those who are not, told, I love you and you're fantastic. And, you're worth protecting and guiding and growing and pouring into. And what I see in you is fantastic. My favorite quote, by the way, is by Benjamin Disraeli. And he says, the greatest good you can do for another is not to share with him your riches, but to reveal to him his own. So we
It's
were
already within them.
exactly,
So
yeah,
as
it's already
children,
there.
if you say to them, you are special, you are loved, you are enough,
Yeah.
because they just came here, so they don't know that yet. That's why you're
Yeah.
pouring this into them, right? So
Absolutely.
when a grown-up says, I've never had that
Hmm.
growing up, so I don't know that it is in me, so I don't know who I am, or I don't know that I'm enough, or I don't know who I am authentically.
Yeah.
And then you find that sometimes psychologists will say, whatever you were not given, give that to yourself to
Mm.
establish who you are, whatever it is.
Yeah. And yeah, I guess I've never heard that. And I think there's some real value there. It's, and I'm a Christian, so I would say, love your neighbor as you love yourself, right? Kind of what you
Mhm.
said. It's like, man, value yourself. You have absolute immense value. I mean, I would say it this way. I spoke to a guy this weekend who's been married for a long time. He and his wife are just haven't gone through a rough patch. He's just, he was never given, any of this. And, so we were talking about just being kind to yourself and loving yourself. But here's
Mhm.
what's interesting. What if you don't know who that person is? What is to love? What is it? How could you, for instance, Roberta, I've known you for, 20 minutes, right? So
Right.
I could say something, again, just knowing you for 20 minutes, I can, see something and say something, right? So I can say, wow, you're so respectful. And so, like we're on a podcast together and your questions are so great. I love that you prepared in advance. I feel valued because you put the work into, to this podcast to value my time. And, so thank you for that. I can tell that that's a value of yours because you showed up prepared today, that kind of thing. But what would it look like, for again, adults who never received that?
Mhm.
It's surrounding yourself with people who can mine for gold. So when they see you stepping out of your comfort zone or saying something that's meaningful to you, they, later in the day, they can say, hey, by the way, say Jim or whatever, Jim, I saw that you were acting, in a really passionate way earlier when you were speaking to this person. And I want you to know that that landed really well. Like you spoke with conviction and authority, and what you said was valuable. It's those types of comments, right? That extrinsic, love and validation
Mhm.
that what ultimately establishes, who we are. It galvanizes it. We have to have that external stimulus, period. In fact, I heard someone say the other day, life is about relationships,
Right. You'll
period,
say that a lot.
period. But it's the only goal of life. It's the absolute hierarchy. It's relationships. The rest of it is a context to experience people in. There's no other purpose in life. And that's why when people are suffer of, anxiety and depression, they start to isolate and it gets worse
And
because
in
we
relationships, sorry to interrupt you, David, the first
yeah.
relationship is with yourself.
Yeah.
It's what we were talking earlier, which is if you haven't been given what you were supposed to, find a way, and professionals can help you for you to give it. Because the first relationship you have is with yourself. How you communicate with yourself
Hmm.
then translates to how you're going to communicate with David, with the rest of the world,
I
because it
love
all
it.
starts here.
Yeah, and it's so true, and so many of us were never taught that. I didn't really. I didn't really understand that paradigm until recently, and I'm 50. Maybe in my mid 40s, I, started to kind of understand this idea of what does that really mean to know myself and to love myself and, to honor those things in me, to cause those things to kind of come forth and so on. And then, of course, help others along that path. I think it's the point of life is to cause others to thrive. But when we all do it, it's
Hmm.
magic. It's absolute magic.
And we
Oh,
all certainly benefit, yeah. So when
yeah.
we know who we are, we then are able to not only communicate with others in we you were talking about the golden rule earlier, but we also have what they call the platinum rule, which
Mm.
is, so the golden rule says love your neighbor as yourself or treat them the way you want to be treated. But platinum rule says communicate with David the way he prefers to be communicated to.
Oh, I love that. No, yeah, know your audience. Yeah.
Yes, yes.
Yeah. I
And
think
so,
that's beautiful.
yeah, so when you know who you are, you said we communicate based on who we are. How do you then add that, like you said, know your audience, add the platinum rule to that? Because you are communicating the way
Oh,
you are.
well, so what I think is fascinating, right, is you're not so I'll be honest, I think that's very wise, but you're not ceasing to become yourself, right? You're just using the highest version of yourself, your intuition, to say, how do I use my highest skill set to communicate something to this type of a personality or this type of a person, this type, maybe they've got a particular history or whatever that is that would land really well. So I'm bringing forth my values, my strengths, my history, my repetitions, all that kind of stuff in order, to navigate, loving this person, helping this person, causing them to grow and thrive and understand. But you're just accessing the best parts of who you are in order to do that skillfully, I think.
Mhm. While staying authentic and knowing who you are.
Yes. Yes.
Hmm. Any, before we get into your book, the Guardians of Grit, any last words for someone who feels that they are still, like you said, you've learned this in your late 40s, now 50,
Yep.
who feels like I'm still trying to find, you know how when people like Tony Robbins and they have these seminars and they say to people, what do you want? They always say people don't know what they want.
Right.
They think they do, but they don't. They know what they don't want in their lives right now,
Yep.
what they wish would go away, but people don't generally know exactly what they want. And I think what you
Yeah.
spoke about today is also a reflection of that because they don't know who they are
Yeah.
sometimes.
And
So what
here's
would you say to them? Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, so I'm going to make two distinctions. I spent most of my life trying to generate who I was, right? Accomplishments and things like that. So I didn't think I had an identity or that I mattered unless I worked really hard and did really profound and cool things. So I suffered under the weight of being a human doing and not a human being for a long time.
Please say that
So
again.
yeah, well, I'm sure I'm stealing it from somebody else. I don't know who first said it, but I
Mm.
suffered under the weight of being a human doing and not a human being for far too long. And I was so desperate to become someone, or at least not be a nobody, and as opposed to what? As opposed to kind of what we're talking about here is just relaxing into the person that God made me to be, identifying those things that make me me and operating out of that place and really drawing I would say that driving a stake in the ground and having the confidence to say this is who I am, this is the type of impact that I want to have, these are my values, this is the dent in the universe that I like to have, this is the things that light me up and give me goosebumps. And if someone doesn't like that for some reason, that's okay, wish them well. We don't have to please everybody.
No,
And
no. And a lot of people suffer from that. Yeah.
Yeah, so I think there's a big difference between trying to become someone and then just relaxing into who you are. So that so to your question though, if someone, doesn't understand that, they don't know who they are and they just feel that inner chaos and anxiety, really largely I would say surround yourself with people who can help you And again, it's not, I think it's way more practical than it is this ethereal woohoo type language. It's very practical, very touchable, very intellectual. You can literally just start being asked the right questions. And when you answer the right questions, you've identified who you are. It doesn't have to be some weird something. It's very practical and very touchable. And of course, Dr. Andy Garrett and I do that. And, my upcoming book, Guardians of Grit, we're focusing on men first. But this is what we're doing. We're literally introducing people to themselves so that they can do the same thing for their children. I like to tell people, "Hi, I'm David Osk. Let me introduce you to yourself." And they can do that for their kids. They can look at their kids and say, "Hey, my son's name is Parker. My daughter's name is Kate. Hey, Parker, let me introduce you to yourself." And what does that mean? I'm going to ask you really great questions. And when you give me an answer that I think is just, spot on, I'm going to validate that. I want to be like, "Oh yeah, man, you nailed it. I
Mhm.
totally see you doing that." We were as parents, right? And I'll just say guardians, we were called to raise our children, to cause them to rise. Well, what does that mean? It means causing them. The word is not rise necessarily, it's really them. It's this idea of identifying the greatest good, the summum bonum inside of somebody, and pouring life-giving water on it, pouring love on it, pouring validation on it, shining a spotlight on it. I'll be honest, Roberta, we need that. We need love, that. We need something that's very tangible, more
Mhm.
than we need air. And the proof is in the pudding there. I talked to 3 people this last week who are in their 50s who are contemplating, I wouldn't say necessarily suicide, but one of them told me, I guess they kind of all did, if my car got wrapped around a tree on the way home, I wouldn't necessarily mind. They're just tired of the struggle of trying to just generate, and they're exhausted.
Mm.
And all they really have to do is kind of, let the pressure out of the tank, hey, you're enough, and start answering really great questions. What do you believe about this? Well, what do you believe about that? What is it that lights you up? What is it that gives you goosebumps? But then we also need a tribe. We need and first and foremost, a family, but we need people around us as adults, to help us, galvanize those things, right? There's still a 12-year-old in every single one of us, and I don't care how old you are. We
Mhm.
never cease that the need of love and validation, period. And that's what I think is so magnificent about, life. It's all about the relationship.
Absolutely. And speaking of tribe, I'm from the Zulu tribe. And one thing I've noticed with living outside of South Africa is that, especially in America, no judgment, but I feel that here it's very individualistic, the culture, compared to
Yeah,
where I come from. And that's why
totally.
people feel so isolated,
Yep. Yeah.
you know.
It's a really great point. And I think we're missing out in America. I think there's some really great things about personal responsibility and all that kind of thing, right? And so you don't
Mhm.
just pass the buck onto somebody else and think that's, somebody else should be paying your bills and providing for you. I get that. But guess what? The tribe, this idea of a community, we'll just say a small town or whatever it is, right?
Knowing you can reach out to someone, because I have
Yeah,
spoken to some of my American friends, and sometimes they'll tell me things that happened for a long time, for like a span of 25 years. I said, "You never spoke to a single soul." Uh, I can count 10 people already that I can speak. You know what I mean?
isn't
And
that
not that
great?
they'll always have a solution or anything, but just knowing someone's gonna be there for me. They don't have
It's
that. And
incredible.
I thought that was mind-boggling.
Yeah. Yeah. And you're right. You nailed it. I think it's absolutely vital. Yeah. Vital.
Absolutely. Be authentic and find your identity. David Ask, the entrepreneur and inventor who is also an author of The Guardians of Grit and has a lot that he has shared with us today based on how we communicate based on who we are. Sorry about that.
Mm.
Thank you so
Well,
much for being on the show today. Please tell us one last time where to find your book and where listeners can reach you.
yeah. Yeah. So you can go to guardiansofgrit.com. The book will be done soon. And then visit my website is davidask.com.
And ask really good questions,
That's
especially
right.
so that you can find the right answers you know how to ask. Thank you so much, David Ass, entrepreneur and
Thank
inventor.
you.
Don't forget to my absolute pleasure. Don't forget to subscribe,
Thanks.
leave a rating and a review on Apple and Spotify, and stay tuned for more episodes to come.